Quite irrelevantly, and not very discreetly, he burst out, upon catching sight of this branch. "The old man brought bad news tonight, kid. Devilish news. He's selling I don't know what of his Glastonbury property to I don't know who, and leasing for an ordinary person's life term. What he can't sell. It's old Geared, of course, who's at the bottom of it. But it'll be terribly, terribly serious for Philip. I ought really to let Philip know, tonight, so that he can take measures, if there are any measures to take. He says distinctly that he's sold at least a third of the Crow dye works. They are only the newest ones, but still, I was perfectly flabbergasted. I know he owed the land, of course, but I somehow thought Philip had built all the dye works. But of course he didn't. He only improved the old ones out by the cemetery. It now appears he's only had these new ones on a lease, and this lease is now up. If these people, Garrett and the rest, don't choose to lease him up to him again, they could kick him out. And they will kick him out. There's no doubt about it. They all hate him like the devil, and nothing would give him more pleasure than to bring him down a few pegs." Persephone herself was a little surprised and shocked by what she felt in response to this. For many dark and complicated reasons, she actually felt a spasm of pleasure at hearing of this disaster to Philip. She had been deeply piqued, for one thing, by his obvious ability to get on perfectly well without her. For another thing, she had accepted, for good and all, her husband's views as to the injustice of the capitalist system. But there was a much subtler reason than either of these for Percy's throb of unconsciously pleasure at hearing this startling news. Philip's chief hold upon her imagination had been her idea of him as a swift, raptorial man of action, competent, unscrupulous, deadly. But this news showed him as outwitted and something of a fool. And this development left the fortress of her heart free for Zoyland. She was in her queer fashion watching with an intense inner interest her feelings about Zoyland. She felt that she was still, though they were far from the boat, under the spell of his portentous magnetism, of his overpowering physique. When Philip had loosened his hold upon her, she had very quickly become mistress of herself. She had shaken off her contact with him as if it had been no more than a kiss. But something surely, deeper than that, had been touched by Zoyland's possession of her in the hayboat. Furtively, in the darkness, she allowed herself to fondle the man's muscular wrist. And then, from his wrist, her long, slim hand slipped down to his great swaying hips. Here, as her fingers strayed, she found one of the leather straps of his braces hanging loose. From when he had been buying that set of heavy teacups at Wallops, he had been persuaded to purchase a new pair of braces for himself by the youth who were at Nietzsche. In these articles his powerful fingers found it very difficult to button. When he felt her knuckles against his side, the spontaneous intimacy of the gesture tickled his fancy as much as her actual touch tickled his ribs. And with a deep dropped chuckle, he stopped dead. "Do it up as you can, kid," he laughed. "It's beating me, that bit of leather." She put both her hands to it, and finally, though not without an effort, she got it fastened. This was the first time in Persephone's whole life that she had buttoned a man's button. It was a quaint little incident, but in the particular kind of intimacy it affected some nerves in her wild, perverse nature that sent a delicious shiver through her whole frame. She felt like some elemental creature of the night, some wandering, elfish thing that was taking care of a primeval earth giant. No woman in all Glastonbury had less of the maternal in her composition than this erratic boy-girl. But by thinking of herself as an elf waif and of her paramount paramour as a fairy tale giant, she made off this trifling incident as they stood there in the river-scented darkness, something that was significant and even symbolical. To their surprise, for human beings, they are very like animals in their expectation of finding what they have left exactly as it was when they left it. They found, on their re-entrance into the parlor, Nell and Dave and Matt Decker seated around a small, cold supper. Dave rose quickly to get them chairs, for their places at the table had been prepared for them. And while they sat down, they could hear Zookie Pippards crooning and murmuring to the baby in the room above. In the center of the table, side by side with a vase of small bronze-colored chrysanthemums, Nell had placed the little golden cup, and this small object at once became again the topic of general conversation. Although Matt Decker had been a stubborn struggle with his religious conscience not to allow his overwhelming feeling for his son's mistress to betray itself in any overt manner, his whole being had been so stirred by these long, sweet, lonely hours in semi-darkness with her and her child, that he flooded her, saturated her, drowned her in the heady worship of his suppressed passion. It was therefore from an atmosphere of limitless and enfolding idolatry that Nell found herself faced, at first by a bodily absence, and then by the absence of mind of her husband and her sister-in-law. She had kept Matt Decker and Dave waiting half an hour for their supper, but then, when the absent ones had not returned, she had told Zookie to bring in all there was in the house. Matt Decker was too excited to eat very much, but half his normal appetite was enough, with the aid of Dave, who was ravenous for food, to dispose of the more substantial viands that Zookie had made available to find. And there was little left for Zoyland and Percy except sponge cake and black currant jam. Now, although suppressed desire is destructive of appetite, satisfied desire is creative of extreme hunger. Let me read that again, because I don't understand. Now, although suppressed desire is destructive of appetite, satisfied desire is creative of extreme hunger. All right? And happy as Zoyland and Percy were in their secret union, they both felt a very sharp craving for some kind of solid and substantial nourishment. Still trying to figure out what that means. Below the surface of the most civilized human beings, the hunger lust darts and snaps like a fish, snatches and rends like a bird, growls like a wolf, snarls like a panther, buzzes like a hornet, bleats like a sheep, and stamps like a bull. And there is nothing so aggravating to hungry stomachs as the sight of dirty plates pushed away from satisfied rival stomachs. Mrs. Pippard was so tired and cross after a party that Nell had not liked to demur at anything she did. And indeed, when cold ham, tinned sardines, and scrambled eggs appeared, she knew well enough that the resources of her larder were exhausted. Unfortunately, nothing looks more tantalizing to hungry eyes than bits of cold toast upon which scrambled eggs had been served, or more offensive to the aesthetic sense of hunger, for hunger has its aesthetic sense, than the scales and tails of sardines upon oily plates. Thus, however happy the two adulterers were in each other's society, and whatever secrets of this curious neutral night they brought into White Lake Cottage with them, when they found themselves confronted by the sponge cake, it was very difficult to retain their high spirits. Percy wouldn't like a couple of boiled eggs and a cup of tea, cried Zoyland in a casual, airy, jaunty manner. I'm sorry, said Nell, but the kettle is cold, and there are no more eggs. Well, anyway, let's have some cheese. Zoyland's voice had become a good deal less airy. But Matt Decker broke in. I'm so sorry. I told you how it might be, he muttered, looking anxiously at Nell, for he had finished every bit of her excellent cheddar cheese before he proceeded to light his pipe. "I'm afraid I ate more than my fair share of the sardines," said Dave anxiously. "But I expect there is..." And he looked at Nell with a pathetic masculine faith in the unlimited resources of feminine providing. "I expect there is something." "Well, I know what I can get for Percy, anyway," cried Zoylan angrily, leaping up and rushing into the kitchen. "Take off your boots if you go up to your room," warned Nell. "He'll be sure to hear, and Zuki has only just this minute got him off to sleep." But Zoylan took not the slightest notice of this request, and sure enough, in a short time, they could all hear the creaking sound of his heavy steps as he walked through the attic anteroom into his smoking room. Nell rose indignantly to her feet, listening intently. Persephone helped herself to a piece of thin bread and butter, a piece that had already acquired a certain dry consistency, which indicated that it had been left over from tea. From somewhere outside, away to the back of the house, where there was a clump of naked larches, not leeches, naked larches, came the barking of a fox. But for once Matt Decker was oblivious to this exciting sound. His eyes were fixed with a furious sympathy upon Nell's white face. His long fingers were clenching themselves under the table, their nails pressing into the palms of his hands. As for Dave, he was occupied in a vain attempt to open a ginger beer bottle. "You'll like some of this, wouldn't you?" he whispered across the table to his wife. Then he added in a still lower voice, "It won't open, though." In the silence that ensued, everybody could catch the audible lifting of an angry infant's moan, a moan full of a self-pity that amounted to anguish. "He's woke up," cried Nell, biting her lip and casting a wild look of blind appeal upon Matt Decker. "Hush! Listen!" whispered Persephone. And while in the further distance the heavy tramp of Zoylan's boots was audible, they all caught the lilt of an esoteric jumble of West Country rhymes chanted over the cradle. "Un to drivor, bells of Gert's Edgemoor, who can make pancake, thou fat or your? These are Harry's mother sold her bed and laid it clover. Wait she a dirty slut, dazzle her bed and lay in dirt. 'Pon my life and honour, grin to Mark's tower. Who should I see but Zuki's baby? 'Pon my life's and honour." Thank you. In the interior of White Lake Cottage, this singular lullaby was very audible and not devoid of significance. But its effect upon the infant was the reverse of soothing. Something in the sound of the child's crying, when it burst out again now, made Matt Decker think of a small, vesicated dog he had heard howling once and that he could never get out of his head. Nell's face became distorted with anger. She felt as if each step Zoylan took upon those creaking boards up there was taken upon the outstretched nerves of Sam's child. She could see the way its funny chin, the very replica of Sam's, was wrinkling itself up in its blind suffering. But she clutched the back of her chair and tried to force herself to remain where she was. "If I go up," she thought, "I'll say something to Will which he'll never forgive, and which I never shall want him to forgive." That's Glastonbury for today. Another grim, gray day out there. Hope it's better wherever you are. Cheers.